Good afternoon and welcome to our discussion on conflict-free chocolate. I'm John Foer with the Institute of Corporate Responsibility at the School of Business at George Washington University, and I welcome all of you. We'll be talking about the relationship and the linkages between cocoa farming and conflict, and we'll be wondering what can be done in this area to promote peace. So I'm very happy to have our guests with us today. Tim McCullum with Matacassie Chocolate, and Joe Winey with Theo Chocolate, and Mike Godfrey with Rainforest Alliance. Now, for those of you who are out in the audience, I understand here that you can participate with the text feed button, which should be to the right of your video screen, and we welcome you to send in notes or questions, and we'll be looking for those and asking our guests some of those questions as we proceed. So to start, I wanted to ask each of you, what do you think of this idea of conflict-free chocolate? We chose it as a title because, as you may know, the topic of conflict-free minerals has come up and people have started to develop policies around that issue. And we wonder, is that a good starting point to look at some of the issues of chocolate and to frame it that way, or are there other ways that we might frame it? Just wanted to get your general views about that. Tim, if you don't mind starting.
Sure. It's a great question. It implies there's might be something wrong with chocolate or with the way chocolate's produced. So it's good in the sense that it brings some awareness to the chocolate industry. As a term itself, you know, I might be a little lukewarm on it, just to be honest. The idea is to promote something or to raise awareness. Oftentimes it might be better to promote the presence of positives versus the absence of negatives. So if something's, say, conflict-free or slave-free, you might come up with something that might be a little more positive, but I think it's a good start.
Yeah, good. Joe?
Yeah, I think that this concept of conflict chocolate assumes that there's some sort of conflict happening at the farm level for producers. And we've been doing a lot of work in Eastern Congo, site of the worst humanitarian tragedy since World War II, where there is a lot of conflict. And there, cocoa is actually considered to be militia or rebel-proof, because when the militia comes through, they'll take all the goats and the chickens and food and whatever other money there might be, but leave cocoa on the tree because there's nothing else to process. And so we see it as a positive crop in a conflict region. But I think the real issue is poverty. And the cocoa supply chain the farmers are so impoverished, supplying most of the industry today, that lack of economic stability is really where that conflict is, whether it's a war or whether it's human injustice, but that's really at the heart of it. So I think it has peace comes through, in part, prosperity, and cocoa could play a role in that if things change.
Great. Yeah, Mike.
Thank you. I agree with both Tim and Joe. I think emphasizing peace and prosperity is a much stronger message regarding cocoa. And cocoa is part of the agricultural landscape. It's a perennial crop. It's hard to put a lifetime's worth of work in your pocket as you can with diamonds, for example. So I'm not sure the moniker of conflict-free is appropriate with an agriculture crop. And so I think really emphasizing that cocoa production, cocoa farming, and part of the agriculture systems of these communities is a founding for peace and prosperity.
Yeah. You know, some people, of course, probably aren't aware of what's going on, right, in the industry, even though they eat chocolate. But I think there's a number of people, and maybe increasingly, who when they buy a product, right, they want to feel like that the money that they're putting towards that product isn't contributing to something bad. And so you can see how that kind of conflict-free in some areas comes up. But maybe, as we think about it during our conversation, maybe we'll come up with a different phrase, which is a little more positive, right, and accentuates the idea of peace rather than putting on that conflict, because it is a little bit hard. But you know, we'd also need to use some term if we're going to get people's attention and try to explain it to them and put it in a policy context. So it may be convenient, but maybe not the best one. So maybe we'll have to work on that while we're talking. So, well, you know, one of the issues that people say, if you think about chocolate and maybe in that conflict or some of the problems, the economics is one, we'll talk about that. But a number of people have heard about the slavery associated with cocoa farms and have heard about forced labor and wonder about it. And again, we'd just be interested in your experience. I'm sure many people are wondering, is it prevalent? Do you really have to have forced labor to go along with the cocoa farms in order for it to be economic, or are there other ways around it? And maybe if you could just relate some of your own experiences and your thoughts about that, right? That'd be really helpful. Maybe we'll go the other way. Mike, if you don't mind starting.
Sure. That's a good question. I mean, as an agricultural commodity, cocoa does require labor as an input. And there are all sorts of labor at different times of the season. Cropping season, harvest is an intense period of labor input, and there's frequent use of neighbors and family members and the like. To say that it's slavery, to say that it's forced labor, I think is a bit of an injustice to the societies and communities and countries, because the reasons sometimes that family members or younger people get involved is out of poverty. And there are regional drivers. If we look at the Côte d'Ivoire and their production of cocoa, a lot of the poverty in the neighboring countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, the northern part of Côte d'Ivoire, families would allow their family members to migrate into receiving families as a way of supporting their poverty, as a way of helping them out. So I think the forced labor, the slavery element, is very strong. Can you find cases of abuse in that kind of system? Yeah. And I think it's a societal problem. And I think, producing countries, governments, civil society, industry, the whole value chain can get involved in helping to educate and, advocate against that. But it is a complex problem.
Yeah, that's it. Joe, what's been your experience?
Well, I've worked with cocoa farmers throughout Latin America and Africa for the last, almost 25 years now. And I've seen all different forms of labor. And I have to say that my first trip to West Africa to meet cocoa farmers there in the early mid-90s, as a kid, I was shocked by the poverty that I experienced on the farm. And so have there been reported problems with slavery on cocoa farms? There has been. Is it something that's widespread? I can't imagine that it's so widespread that it's an epidemic, but the poverty is an epidemic. And it's not a social issue, it's an economic issue, in my opinion. I believe that there is a society that, that does allow these apprenticeship programs like you were talking about to feed young family members to the richer South to make sure that they have some chance at a better life. But fundamentally, the economics are broken, and that's what the problem is. And so we see it as a consumer concern that when you buy a chocolate bar for $1, the cost for that production of that chocolate bar are primarily externalized. And so as a result, the value of that is actually much higher. And so if consumers start to change the way that they approach buying everything, but certainly chocolate, and value it, and companies in the industry are transparent, truly transparent about their practices, then I think there's an opportunity to create the kind of change that will bring the economics in line so we don't have those kinds of labor issues.
Yeah, good. Tim, what about your experience?
I think those are both great points. Definitely agree across the board with what Joe said, and it's an economic issue. Personally, we operate in Madagascar, which is part of Africa, but in some ways the cocoa collection system there is a little bit different. It's a much smaller game, it's a smaller amount of cocoa, and what you have are a lot of small individual farms, small farm holders who might operate 20 hectares a person, and there isn't the big industrialized cocoa machine that exists in West Africa, which is typically, if there are instances of forced child labor, that's where they come from. What we see on the ground is much different. There is a lot of child labor in the sense that these are family farms, so their kids help out on the farm, but it's no different than how, in the U.S. you would help your parents with chores around the house. But almost anything we talk about today, I think, could be tied back towards an economic issue. And I think what most average chocolate consumers here in the U.S. might not be aware of is just the sheer discrepancy between the way people live in Africa and typical cocoa farmers throughout the world, whether it's Latin America, South America, Africa, Asia for that matter, how those people live versus how the people eating the product live. And it's two different worlds entirely. But if people can better understand that and maybe make different decisions when they purchase chocolate, I think that's a step in the right direction as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you have too. I mean, I've seen the videos up on YouTube, where kids are up there and they say they've been brought in slavery. And so it makes a very strong impression, emotional impression. And I can even imagine some people who have seen that as well are thinking, well, you're just, if I could put it this way, right, you're just apologizing, or you're apologists for, right, businesses that in fact don't really have it. But I think that's part of the discussion. If in your own experiences, right, you really haven't seen it, that maybe there's nothing endemic about having that slave labor involved in the cocoa farming.
Yeah.
Of course, there's been incidents, and so not saying there's not, but I'm just like trying to draw upon your own experiences. I'm sure maybe other people have other experiences.
The other thing I'd point out is both of our companies are relatively small in the grand scale of chocolate production.
Yeah.
Therefore, like the grand scale of the way cocoa is harvested and collected, to the extent that there is forced child labor or unethical practices, it's really a much larger set of companies that might be, trying to get the best price, for example, therefore putting the most
Yeah.
pressure on the producers.
Yeah. Well, if I might ask you, so as a smaller company, right, compared to the very large ones, do you feel like you can manage or have some responsibility then for what happens on the farms where you source
Yeah.
that you're growing from? And could you just say a little bit about how you do that or what your approach is to accomplishing that?
Sure. And I would say I think it's easy if you're small and sitting where we are. It's a lot easier to do what we do. I try to imagine one day when we might be the size of a large company, and it'd be much more difficult to do what we do. But we work with about 4 cooperatives of cocoa farmers. Each cooperative has anywhere between 20 and 30 farmers, families, and then those are all family operations. But we work directly with them in that we've helped form the cooperative. We'll go in and install equipment that they need to do the fermentation and drying steps, which is a key component to the chocolate process. It's also a value-added step that most farmers don't have. But because we're small, we are able to interact with every farmer that we purchase from. We have technicians in the field on site with the farmers daily to make sure that the quality control is maintained. Again, easier to do when you're small. When you're big, that's probably not possible. Or if it is, maybe you do it, almost as a pilot or as a test, but not as a widespread, this is how we do business type of thing.
Yeah. And how big is your company?
In terms of people, we have on the ground in Madagascar, it's about 120 farmers, 15 technicians. At the factory, there's about 30 employees or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, we're in our 5th year of business.
Yeah, that's really interesting and helpful. Joe, do you want to say for your own experience as well?
Well, we're very different. We're a chocolate maker. We go from the bean ourselves all the way to the finished product, which is different than Madagascar. And the experience that we've had, we're building a model that is designed to scale. We've worked with larger companies, and I know what their issues are, and I understand how you can go to scale at the farm level. And so I don't think it's that hard for a large company to do. I disagree that small is, that's just a particular mindset around the issue. At the heart of it, business is built to provide a product or service to their customers at a price that the customers can afford and that they believe has value while generating profit for the shareholders. That's a general idea of what a business is. Well, if the will of the consumers is that there is integrity in the supply chain and that all of the farmers are paid well, define paid well, that's another series in and of itself, but it's an interesting question. That the landscape is healthier and the ecology of the farm is strong. If consumers demand that, companies who control so much of the cocoa supply chain can solve that problem. The issue is that you have the pie's not expanding, right? At Dollar Chocolate Bar, that company is competing with some sugar candy or something else that's really inexpensive. So you can see their conundrum. Mm-hmm. But if consumers demand it, I have full confidence that these smart people in these large businesses can find the way to actually deliver the product with integrity all the way through. I see this as a consumer issue. I don't think the industry is just responsive to the consumers.
Right. Well, I think we'll get a chance to talk about that, later on. So, Mike, so we talked about some of the issues that have come up social, right? But what about this economic model, that Joe had talked a little bit about and Tim did as well. So what are kind of the economic consequences in cocoa farming? Some people cite the low wages that happen, and then that doesn't lead to development. And can you just elaborate a bit on what you've seen and your experiences with it?
Yeah, there's certainly an economic element to this, and it's probably looms large in the discussions and in farmers' calculation of what to produce and how to produce it, and how to build wealth for their household. And so we try to describe in the sustainable agriculture realm, living wage. What is a wage that can be earned through that production, through cocoa, that farmers can actually support a household and put kids in school and clothes and have a normal, reasonable lifestyle. And it's there's a lot of controversy in cocoa about that living wage, and to say, okay, in a particular country context, if we're checking to see that agricultural workers received a minimum wage, in fact, that may not be a living wage. And I think the industry and everyone involved is looking at this and trying to understand how can they move that needle in a positive sense for the producer. I agree what was said here earlier, but I think businesses can have a tremendous impact, through their codes of ethics, through their sourcing programs. But I think I agree more with Tim. The smaller ones have a little bit of an easy path towards that because they're close to the production unit. They can really drive out and get into the mix and have a very positive impact in the ways that global, multinational corporations that buy cocoa by the shipful, are and working through intermediate traders, and can they drive their code of ethics down through several layers? It becomes a little tougher exercise. They are trying, I do believe that. But economics at the farm level for cocoa is a good question, and they're constantly in the West Africa context. Should we grow cocoa? Should we grow rubber? Should we grow pineapples? Should we grow oil palm? Should we grow foods that the family can eat? And it's a constant juggle by the farmer of what to do and what's best for the family.
I'd also add a point that Mike made, which is, I think, a good one. The reason why I think it's easier for smaller companies to do it is typically smaller companies started for a different reason than large companies started way back when. So in a large company's case, it's usually profit driven, and then they bring in corporate social responsibility as a way to perhaps put a checkpoint against their business activity, or even perhaps market their product and gain a new audience. In the cases of small companies, and I think your company is probably very similar to ours, you didn't necessarily start it to make money. That wasn't the key in the beginning. That needs to be there to stay in business, and you need to have the right finances in place to attract investment and to grow and to gain market. But I think you'd have to look at why were the businesses started in the first place. Whereas if you're a large corporation and you're trying to implement some sort of corporate social responsibility platform, it might be a little more challenging to do that because, well, they existed first as a single bottom line company versus other companies that may have been started with the goal of having 2 or maybe even 3 bottom lines at the same time.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can, talk about this economics thing a little bit more where, for some people there's a trade-off between the corporate socially responsible thing to do and just the realities of the marketplace. So if we're talking about a livable wage, right, which might be an aspiration, but when you're working with the farmers and how much they're paid, would you say you're able to pay them a livable wage? And if you are, then people would think, well, that's going to make your chocolate more expensive, which means the product, when it comes to market, is going to be more expensive, and maybe people just aren't willing to pay that amount of extra money for it. And sometimes they don't even know why it's more expensive. Can you just talk about, again, kind of your own experience with that wage and how much you pay and what part that plays in your business?
Yeah, I know it's a great it's a great question, price. What we pay farmers, you have a couple of different ways you can look at it. So you have like the fair trade price, and as a fair trade certified company, we would pay at least that. We, in fact, pay a little bit more because of the caliber of the cocoa we're sourcing is a different quality, so it trades on a different market, and it's typically more expensive than even fair trade cocoa. The wages that the farmers get from the cocoa income is plenty for them to have a living wage. It's good for local Madagascar standards. Juxtapose, if you take a cocoa farmer compared to like the average person in Madagascar, the cocoa farmer's relatively well off because their crop yields more than what most people farm in Madagascar, which is rice. So I think that's a good thing. In terms of the price point that you hit at the market, that's a whole another question. And yeah, if you have a chocolate bar that costs $8, but the market's kind of ready to pay $3 for chocolate, you're going to have a struggle. Our price point is somewhere right in the middle. But one of the differences that you need to think of is in any consumer product is, I think what people are looking for is not just products that do good, but better products that do good. And if when the customer tastes your product and it tastes different than the $2.99 bar or the Hershey's bar or the mass-produced chocolate bar, and it tastes better, then it's not really a problem for the consumer because they can taste what they're paying for.
Right.
But it is always a bit of a trying to find the middle ground between what are people willing to pay, where is their education, what's important to them as a consumer.
Yeah, but it's a really good point, I think. On one side, there's people who's interested in changing the wage structure, right, or how much people get. But in order to do that, you have to look at, right, the other side of it and the product side. And if you can create some value between those two, right, then you can afford to pay the higher wage and you can capture some of that value in the marketplace. Sometimes they get chopped up or siloed, as we might say, right? And so they don't talk about that.
The key is, just to wrap that up, if you're going to, I don't think you can ask a consumer, or I don't think a consumer will pay more for a product just because it does good. But they will pay more for a better product. And the fact that it does good is kind of a byproduct.
Yeah.
And that seems to work in the market.
Yeah. So Joe, you mentioned, with all your experience, and you've seen a lot how the larger companies, do. So in your own experience, and what about is that model of trying to create some more value in a product in the marketplace, knowing that some of that's going to go back, right, really kind of upstream and to the farmer, is that possible and to scale it, do you think? And what are some of the challenges to scaling it?
Yeah, some of the larger largest companies actually have presence on the ground. They're manufacturing at origin. They're very, very close to the farmer and the beans, and they have networks on the ground. And so they have the ability, again, it's sort of where there's a will, there's a way. I agree that the sort of Velcroing on corporate social responsibility division doesn't change the culture of a business. And so when you have the culture of the business from the ground up, having a purpose beyond profit, I think that's a positive thing. But I really look at what we do with our producers. Is it altruism or is it just good business? And so we have our pricing is online, what we pay for cocoa, and it's based on quality. And so of that quality, it's a scale, it goes from, I think, just over $3,000 to closer to $5,000 based on the quality that's important to us. We get a higher quality cocoa, we can make a better product. The farmer knows what they're going to get paid. We've taken a lot of people out of the middle. And then consumers will pay a price because it's better product, right? That's pretty simple. The development side, the reason that it's important for us that farmers are paid well is so that they can continue for the future to supply us the product that we need at the specification that we require. That is very standard business. Every business will actually say, yeah, it's worth it to me to have a consistent supply at this specification, and there's a price associated. And if they're in partnership with the consumers, then the larger businesses can do this. I mean, let me put it this way, I have faith in the industry. I think that this kind of change is really possible, and I think that, I'm hoping that, we're at the edge of some of those switches being flipped.
Yeah.
If I can add, I agree wholeheartedly that the driver for all of the industry involved in this is future supply and getting it right in the future. And to do that, they're addressing the issues of productivity, of living wage, of quality, of associated services that are around the farm, like education and health, that allow cocoa producers to commit to continue to grow a quality product. I think that really is the core of what's driving industry engagement, and to a lesser extent, but for equally good reasons, corporate social responsibility. But I think it is a business calculation, and they want to get out there and get this right for the future.
There's a model that that we have that we've applied in different countries, but it's really we're finding a lot of success with our partner ECI in the Congo, where we provide training, technical support to produce the crop that we want at the quality that we need. We engage either the co-op or the exporter or an NGO to provide the training to the farmers. But then there's also additional development support so that those producer families have access to information that allow them, if they choose, to engage in better family planning, improved health care, et cetera, so that the fabric of the society strengthens. And that's just good business for us. And everybody ends up winning. So I think that model is not, I mean, it can work. It is working.
Yeah.
One other thing I just wanted to say, and then I'll sort of, just on this price piece, because I think it's hands down the murkiest, muddiest thing out there, which is why I think it's important to actually say what you pay. But the value of a ton of cocoa that, let's say you pay $5,000 for, the value of that to the producer in Ecuador is completely different than the value to a producer in Tanzania, because the cost of living is so different. So that at some point in time you start wondering, if you're in Ecuador, well, do I start growing palm or something else? And so there are some economics that vary based on the country where it's being produced that complicate this, and something for, I think, everyone to be mindful of.
Yeah, well, so and maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, because that's a good point. So someone asked and typed in the question, so why not process, the cocoa in the country of production? So maybe for those, listening and may not, understand the industry and the structure so well, I think the idea is that, if you just go and buy it, take it out of country, and then process it, that the benefits won't be as great for the in-country. So do you mind just talking about kind of just what that issue is maybe, and what are some of the barriers to having it in, why people don't do that more often, maybe just what some of the trade-offs are, so people just understand a little bit better how the industry works and all that.
Can I
Do you wanna
start this
start,
one?
please?
Yeah, I think I have two responses to the question, and it's a very good one. And I think in reality, there's a lot of processing going on in what we call the origin countries. So Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and Indonesia and Madagascar, in Tim's case, there is production and processing and added value before product leaves the country. And I think that's great. I think doing that increases jobs, increases economic return. Then we look back on the historical side, and chocolate in Western society, developed in certain centers, mostly in Europe, and there are family businesses that have, come through the ages with their particular recipes and their particular sources of beans, and they're proud of the chocolate, the Swiss chocolate or the Belgian chocolate that they make. And to take pre-processed product into that kind of a market and their tradition and system is difficult for them. I think they've branched out, and they're doing more and doing better in that regard. But it's just the history of cocoa beans were exported and chocolate was produced in other locations. But it is changing, and I'll be very honest. It's being facilitated by, in some cases, government policy, like Indonesia had used a tax incentive to install processing of beans in their country, and that's working. They're seeing much more processing. So it's a two-edged sword, but it's changing in favor of local value added.
So, but do you know, in those countries maybe where they adopt a policy of trying to capture some of that value added, does that make them a little less competitive in terms of then firms deciding maybe where they want to source and might look for other countries to avoid that tax, or to try to do the processing themselves? Or don't they have as many choices, and can't they be as choosy as to where they're going to source their beans?
No, it has a definite impact on the corporate business decisions and the calculations. And in the case of Indonesia, it changed the mix of who was buying and exporting raw beans. I wouldn't say entirely, but significantly. And so, yeah, it is a business concern. And then you have to. That's one side of the view, and the other perspective is the Indonesian government's view. Wow, we got corporations have built processing facilities, and there's employment, and there's that kind of economic development that's very valued by them. So,
Yeah.
but there are hard decisions that businesses make in that light.
Yeah, and maybe just last on that, I mean, when the businesses make that kind of investment decision or at a process, can they afford to be flexible and change over time? Or once they invest, it's really kind of a long-term commitment to that capital, so they can't just move and choose, right, to different countries depending on the policy?
Well, I think it's definitely more long-term.
Yeah.
I mean, they could divest and change that way, but I think the commitment is there for the facility. And backing up facilities is the agricultural watershed, if you may. The geography that's feeding the supply, and of course they would be reaching out and trying to develop that in the most sustainable way that they could, because they've got a lot of investment on the line. But I think it's long term.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Joe, what do you think?
I think it's a positive thing. I don't think it's the only way, for sure. I've seen a lot of processing at origin in West Africa, and I think one of the positive impacts from these, and some of the plants are pretty large. I mean, it's really impressive. What they do is that there's technological sharing and development, and I think in some of those cities it helps to build a stronger middle class. At the end of the day, really the impact that interest in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of farmers and the acres that they steward, and that's really where this, I think, that it's part of a model. I don't see it.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think for us, we do all of our production in Madagascar, and in some ways, that's what we wanted to do from the beginning. And if we think back to why we started our business, I remember the very value chain of a chocolate bar. This was like 2006 or 7, and it was the first time in my life I realized that the amount of cocoa that is in a chocolate bar represents a very, very small amount of the cost of goods to actually produce a chocolate bar. Yet fair trade has kind of been accepted as this is one of the answers to poverty. Our background was, before we started this company, we were in the Peace Corps in Madagascar, so we really felt for the country and got to know the people locally and speak the local language, and a sense that if not only was no one doing it, no one was even talking about it at the time, make a high-end, quality chocolate bar stuff. So that's kind of what we set out to do. Just knowing that that's one piece. It's not just the processing, that's another piece. The resource locally, the packaging is sourced locally. When you put all that together, it does have a larger economic impact per chocolate bar. Joe's absolutely right. The wider impact needs to include a lot more farmers, and that's done through scale. But having kind of, when we got into it, I can't fully say we knew what we were getting into. And there are a lot of obstacles to trying to produce, locate the source in a country that does not have roads, does not have the access. The government would kind of not and just plow through whatever obstacles are kind of thrown up in front of you.
Well, so someone else asked in the question, this might be just a matter of kind of gathering what we've talked about before, but what they're asking is, why is it so difficult then for a large firm, right, to take the risk of paying farmers a fair wage, right? So if in your companies you're able to do it and then capture some of that value in the marketplace and try to make those arrangements, but why is it so difficult maybe for a company to do it, or at least saying many of them haven't done that yet, right, and don't pay a fair wage or a livable wage?
Yeah, and I think defining a fair wage or livable wage is difficult. We charge a lot more for our chocolate bars than the conventional product charges, and so as a result, we can shift more of the money back into the farm and buy a high quality ingredient. And there are some conventional manufacturers who pay a great price for cocoa, and it's based on quality. It's often considered niche, and so when you start to take it, out of a commodity and make it more of a special product, that's where the change happens. Because let's keep in mind, it's not that the larger companies are not making a decision to pay farmers less. They're making a decision to buy cocoa and cover their risk, and so they use a futures market to do so. And that's not an intentional, well, we're going to pay those guys less kind of issue. The futures market is something that is set up to benefit a relatively small number of people. So it doesn't really benefit the producers. There's always a market for them to sell the crop into. But the thing to be mindful of when you look at the commodity market is that the price is often impacted by speculation in the marketplace, not necessarily purely by supply and demand. So as soon as you step out of that marketplace and have direct relationships, and many of the large companies do actually, you can start to create change. And then I think then you can ask a question: what is the right price for this product at this spec?
Yeah. Well, so do you see on the horizon chocolate products changing than maybe how we're used to, confronting them now? So it made me think of coffee and how going from, just getting a simple cup of coffee then to all the different things you can get at Starbucks and all the things you can get at McDonald's, and the companies make a lot of money by using those products. Can you see chocolate somehow moving into that same realm and presenting it to people in ways they never thought of before?
I think it's a cultural shift. Sorry to hop on this because I have something that I think is important for us to think about. Is that there's a broader cultural shift certainly in North America towards higher quality food experiences, and so chocolate is a part of that. But the other component to watch, and this is something that we've seen in the marketplace, and again I've brought in the first container of organic beans to this country 20 years ago. I've seen the shift over that span of time. And as the reports came out on the health benefits of cocoa, suddenly it's starting to shift to darker chocolate. Now, that's still at the upper end of the scale, but I think that within the next 10 years, we're going to be seeing some really interesting products come onto the market that are cocoa-based, that are focused on our health. It's not a candy, it's not part of an obesity issue, it's something that's healthful and good for you. And that's going to shift the economics for cocoa as much or more than what I would call conventional candy.
Yeah, that's it. What do you think, Tim?
I'd agree. I think the coffee industry is a nice parallel. There are several other industries that kind of parallel. But if you think back to the 1980s, like our understanding of coffee was, Sanka and Maxwell House and Folgers. And the idea that 30 years into the future, you'd walk into a store called Starbucks and pay for the pleasure of, a $5 cup of coffee, people would think you're crazy. And today, not 10 years ago, people weren't talking about fair trade. They weren't talking about producing more chocolate at origin. They weren't talking about half of the things that we're talking about today. So the consumer's more educated, and it is part of a much broader food movement in the U.S. That's kind of deconstructing everything that happened in the 40s and 50s with like large mass scale production. So it takes time. I'd say chocolate's a little bit behind coffee. We might be in like 1995 in coffee years, but that's changing, and it's a good sign for chocolate for sure.
Yeah. Well, how does that, though, if we can imagine all these different uses with chocolate, right, with, as you were saying, a higher price but a higher value, but how does that value then get back to the farmer, or in such a way which promotes development, and particularly if you have big companies, right, which are at the lead of it, and obviously trying to capture as much value for their shareholders as they possibly can? Is there a mechanism in place, aside from the ones that you had talked about on the smaller scale, that can do that, or can we imagine what might be the future of that?
Well, there is a question around what role certification might play. I think some of the larger companies, as public companies, actually already have a reporting tool that they could relatively easily expand, and some of them already are doing social audits that are incredibly well thought out. And again, you can just build onto this. Transparency is a key. Everyone should demand, what do you pay for your cocoa, and what does that supply chain look like? There are so many, I call it greenwashing, there's so many claims about what something is or isn't. And I think the thing that's important is say, this is what we do, this is how we do it, and let people make that choice. And you plug it into the reporting models that the large companies know how to use well. Consumers are buying a higher value crop, everybody starts to win.
Yeah. Well, this may be a good time, if you don't mind, Mike, is that when we think about certification, that often becomes the solution people then want to move towards, right? But if you might just take a minute and talk about Rainforest Alliance and what it does with its certification, just so for people listening, can understand first, is kind of setting the stage for looking at certification. Does it address some of these problems we've talked about before? Are there other ways of getting at it? If you don't mind just taking a few minutes.
Sure, John. Certification is founded on a set of standards. And 25 years ago, Rainforest Alliance worked with another consortium of NGOs, most of which are in Latin America, that is called the Sustainable Agriculture Network, that developed a set of standards for what is sustainable agriculture and a tool, a checklist for validating that that is the system of production that producers opt to produce under. And so certification is simply a tool, one of many, to go out and check that production aligns with certain social, environmental and economic criteria that are built into those standards. Child labor is in there, wages in there, access to public services, productivity, these kinds of things. And when that system is more complete as measured through a certification system, and there are many, Rainforest Alliance is not alone in this, but was one of the pioneers. When a certification system validates that, it's understood and it's been measured that there's more sustainable, longer term value in production in that kind of a system. So that's it simply.
Great.
And there are a lot of checks and balances. It's all part of a larger system that validates, Rainforest Alliance's work and others as well. And so, but it is just one tool, John, that's used to try to move the needle on agriculture, sustainable agriculture.
So if someone was listening, because you'd mentioned the standards that are set, I'd address many of the issues exactly that we've talked about here. So maybe someone's just saying, why don't we just have everything certified, right? Set whatever the wages should be, set what the standard should be, and then just have everything certified, and wouldn't that just take care of all these issues and put pressure on the large companies to use the certifications, and then wouldn't we be done? Is there something not so simple about the issue?
Would that same person who's asking that very simple question say, and by the way, I'm willing to pay 2 or 3 times the price that I normally pay for my conventional chocolate?
Right.
So I would put that question back, and if they say, yeah, absolutely, then I think we can go into the quicker problem-solving mode.
Right. But we don't see much evidence, right, amongst consumers and a whole range of products that are certified that are either willing to pay that additional price or even recognize what the certification means or why that label is on. Right, there's a lot of lack of understanding amongst the consumers of certification, let alone whether they'd be willing to take a few more dollars out of their pocket in order to go do it. Huh?
If I could add something that I think is an important element. I mean, Joe mentioned that there is a trend, a movement towards having a better quality of food, a better eating experience, and fine flavor chocolate and better chocolate is delivering that. But inherent in all of this, and one of the tools that underpins certification is where does it come from, and ensuring that you have what is called in the industry traceability. Can you measure the bean? Can you track the beans from a production plant in Europe back to that farm? And traceability is an immensely complex mechanism when you're talking about commodity agriculture, because things get bulked and then divided up and blended with other ingredients and things like this. But there's a huge effort underway to stand up in cocoa the traceability systems that would guarantee for Joe and Tim that if that bean being sold is coming from that farming system in Ghana, you can see through the traders or the processors to you that it is in fact coming from there, and that's hard, but it's growing because we know people want to understand where the food came from.
It may be unfair, but could you even put a percentage on what percentage, say, of the beans now are actually traceable, and you could know when you're buying them where they came from, other than having a direct relationship with the farmer?
Well, I think globally for certified cocoa beans, we're in the neighborhood of 10%, maybe 12%.
Right.
And I would say a fraction of that, maybe down at the 1 or 2% is in because of both collaboration with industry and the hard work of the other actors, private sector and NGOs that are putting up the traceability systems.
Right.
That you could make that claim that they know precisely where it came from beginning to end. But it's moving very rapidly now. You'll see that percentage grow quickly.
Yeah. What do you see the future of traceability then in this
I
area?
think that all cocoa, or at least the vast majority of it, I think can be and will be traceable. The interesting thing about this is that the greatest challenge for executing these kinds of efforts, and certainly with certification, is what I call capacity at the origin, and farmer groups having the business capacity in order to manage the systems that are required to do this. That's a huge opportunity for development. If you take some of the development money, match it up with industry efficiently, with consumers, again, I think that the consumers have to be ready for this. That when you match that up, now you're starting to build not just capacity so you have traceability, but you're building professionals. You're building a middle class that hadn't been there before, and that's immensely exciting. And people are thirsty for work. People are thirsty for knowledge. I just see this as a huge opportunity, and I think that we're going to be successful as a large industry in the coming years.
Yeah.
I want to be here 5 years from now. It'd be great to say all of the industry is operating on standards that are incredibly high, and we're just competing on quality. We're not differentiating ourselves because we're a do-gooder and they're not. That's not the story.
Right.
So that's where I'd like to see it go, and I think it's possible.
Yeah. Well, maybe if we can push it a little bit. I mean, it sounds promising, right? And it makes sense and covers a lot of the issues that we'd like to see addressed. But we have talked about how the wages and linking to price in the marketplace, and so people aren't willing to pay. So maybe it even comes back to what you had said, right? If everyone's willing to pay a couple more bucks, then we could solve it. But it appears, at least right now, they're not. So what can we do to start to close that gap so we can get the production in a way that is closer to what we'd like to see and actually have a competitive product in the marketplace?
And so how do you know that they're not willing to pay the price? When consumers have awareness, at our factory in Seattle, we have over 50,000 people come through on paid tours a year, which I am immensely grateful for. And what we found is that when people start to understand what the issues are, they start to ask really tough questions, and they become engaged. So I think that consumers who are enlightened start to make the right choice. One of the interesting things about consumers during the recession is that organic product sales didn't fall, they didn't drop, because people are exercising their values when they buy certain products, and it's through their awareness that they're making that choice. Once you identify with that product or that service that you believe reflects your values, you're not going to leave. And so I think that there is some potential price elasticity for chocolate. I need to believe in the consumers as well as the industry.
Yeah. Well, it's a fair question to ask when you say, how do we know if they won't pay? Well, we don't know, right? We know that the way we do it and the way that we market it and the way that we present it to them that they're not doing it, but it doesn't mean there aren't countless other imaginative ways, innovative ways, right, of trying to take that product as you're doing and presenting it to them in a way in which they might gladly do it, right? People pay a lot of money for things that anyone else might look at and say, right, there's no way that's worth it. But to them, right, obviously it is. Well, why don't we try to turn all this and focus a bit on our kind of primary question back then again to peace, right? So, because a lot of the issues around chocolate, what we've talked about in the cocoa farming, might be addressed through a perspective of human rights. It might be looked at a perspective of development, right, like we've talked about. But what about this idea of cocoa farming, and what people seem at least all to agree upon is that there's a rapid increase in the demand for chocolate. I mean, I guess you would know more than I do about the growth in China as a potential market, and that we're going to have to produce a lot more chocolate, than we have in the past, or at least produce a lot more cocoa beans than we have in the past. So how will that expanded production affect the communities that we're in, and how does that link to trying to use that effort to build some peace in the community? If we're not going to use conflict-free, what are ways that we can anticipate that happening, and will it contribute to peace, or will some of the practices as we have it now and still paying low wages and the economics of it add and facilitate some of the conflict there? What do you think?
It's a good question. I think it ties into some of the earlier themes as well, that in order for there to be peace and prosperity, well, there needs to be economic opportunity. And if you were to look at also that question that came in about why is it more chocolate produced at origin, well, if the key to helping or encouraging peace has to be an economic solution or providing more economic opportunity in developing countries, you can look at some interesting statistics. Like at a very macro level, the global cocoa market is $5 billion a year. The global chocolate market is $105 billion a year. 65-70% of the world's cocoa comes from Africa. If Africa were to start shipping or selling or producing chocolate instead of cocoa, you could hypothetically generate about $100 billion worth of wealth in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Africa would look much different today with an extra $100 billion worth of private sector wealth. That's not going to happen. That's kind of a very long-term type of vision. But that could be one way where more economic opportunity is created and you have more peace as a byproduct.
Mm-hmm. What about, coming back to that, Joe, you had mentioned at the very beginning, right, that you saw it as that the conflict that might be associated with the areas where there's cocoa farms is really due to an economic issue. What can we do, or what are the options available? I mean, in kind of a practical sense, right? We've talked about paying a living wage, but not everyone can do that. We've talked about certification, but it only covers a small portion. What do we see in the future if cocoa farms are expanding, and the extent to which it might start at least exacerbating or stimulating some conflict, and is there something we can do about that to anticipate it and maybe avoid that?
There's, I think that you have to look at what are the lessons learned along the way with cocoa and chocolate, and how do you apply that to new origins? Because if you look at West Africa, the Sahara's coming south, environmentally it's in trouble. There's questions about whether or not it can be productive long term. There's been moves to bring cocoa to other countries and other regions to help meet the future demand. What I would hope is that the lessons learned are applied in those new growing regions to ensure that there are strong, sound economics, that there is the right type of expertise on the ground to ensure traceability and good certifications, et cetera. And so that would be one thing that I would suggest as a move ahead.
Yeah. And Mike, what about you?
Well, I think that cocoa agriculture can be an extremely strong contributing factor to, peace and prosperity when it flourishes in an environment that that society endorses, and backs and views as a real positive. I mean, if you take the case of Côte d'Ivoire in the previous 5-6 years, I mean, they had the only production system of cocoa that came even close to what an oil producer might have. I mean, cocoa production dominated the exports. It was the biggest source of revenue for the state, and it can be, argued that the state was trying to intervene in ways that reduced the price to the farmer and increased the filled the coffers of the state for not necessarily, the best of intentions. And thankfully that regime has changed, and they're putting in place policies that are actually intended to foster, production, agriculture generally, but cocoa and coffee in Côte d'Ivoire in particular. And I think they're seeing the error of trying to take too much from that and build up the value at the household. So I think the case of Côte d'Ivoire is the one where people can say cocoa and conflict and kind of see a connection the way we started on minerals. But I think that's passing, thankfully, and I think it's evolving in a very positive way very quickly.
Yeah. So someone has asked the question, they said, so how do you reflect to consumers, right, the social good, the social benefit that you're doing in countries where you're sourcing your cocoa? Do you have some practical ideas or even practical examples in which, you've done that, kind of coming back to your point again, Joe, about if you have faith in the consumers, but what are some things that we can do to actually communicate that to them and reflect the social good that's in there?
Yeah, it's really bringing the farmers' stories, bringing everyone closer. I've one of the things that has always amazed me, and this is true in West and Central Africa, is that most cocoa farmers haven't tried chocolate. And there was one farmer I met with last November in DRC, and he said, after he showed me his farm, he had a beautiful farm. He said, "So, what do you do with the cocoa after it leaves my farm?" I said, "Well, we make chocolate." He said, "You mean like the color, like the shoe polish?" And I said, "No, to eat." And he had never heard of it, right? Which I've had this experience before. So of course I happened to have one of our Congo bars, and I brought it. I said, "Well, here, your cocoa. You want to know what it tastes like?" He had no idea it was used for food. His family had no idea it was used for food. And he said, "Well, now I'm going to lift the beans up off the ground. We'll have this beautiful rack to dry them in the sun so it never touches the ground because it's cocoa. He started to feel closer to consumers when he was able to share that product and experience. The more that we can do that with consumers by telling producers' story and shrink that distance between them, the more invested we are in their well-being and their outcome. And same way sharing chocolate was, that farmer is now invested in our business's well-being because he sees the loop.
Yeah, that's great. Mike, do you have any examples from the Rainforest Alliance in terms of this effort in using the certification and communicating to the consumer what the benefits are associated with that label?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. Shrink the distance, bridge that gap, huge gap that's between the consumer and the producer. And I think cocoa that's being brought in at the niche level, where special flavor profiles or special geographies of production, and you communicate that story of what's happening in that village in Ghana or in Madagascar back up to the consumer, that putting stories at point of sale and allowing them to understand and connect at a human level with the source of the cocoa bean is immensely powerful. And I think there's a lot more that's going to be done with consumer education and disconnection, bridging that gap.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, if you go into Whole Foods, right, then you can see they're trying to tell the stories about the farms and where they get their meat from and those kinds of things. What about the role of say social media in doing this? And is there any kind of a generation kind of gap issue here, where maybe younger people who are used to receiving information right over the internet and could learn those stories, not maybe so much packaged as they are through commercials on TV or some of the traditional marketing efforts, but might actually start to connect themselves? Is that a possibility that might be exploited more? And are the younger people a little more interested in buying things that have some of those values associated with it?
I think yes, very, very much so. Social media is one thing, and that's being adopted at people that are a new generation and adopted much more quickly. But it's actually the larger just information age that with information comes a little bit of responsibility from consumers, where they want to know a little bit more about the product. They want to know how it was produced, where it was produced, who are the people on the other end of what I'm eating, and they now have access to that information. So yeah, I think social media can play a role, and that generally as new generations come up behind ours, they're a little more into the idea of maybe spending a little bit extra for food, especially if it has a social component behind it.
Yeah, I think there's a statistic that I saw a couple years ago where graduates from 4-year degrees, university degrees, were looking for meaning in their careers as much as for money. And this concept of you can have your cake and eat it too, which means you can have a business that is thriving while doing the right thing, is sexy now. It wasn't before, and it wasn't as understood. But now this is the cutting edge. This is where people want to go. And so whatever media, media has become so decentralized, right? There's so many different ways that we get information that I think the fact that the internet is so democratic, that these stories can actually infiltrate more easily, and I think that's a real positive thing. We don't have to go through the 3 networks to tell a story through advertising anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to flip this around a bit, because there is a social media gap in the developed world, in Europe and North America especially. There's a technological gap in the developing world, and it's an explosion of information technology that is being put into the hands of farmers. And I would bet even in the far east of the DRC that you have farmers that have a cell phone that can get a text message from a crop extension service saying, this is the month to clean your orchards and compost your old pods. And but also the producers are becoming very savvy with social media too.
Yep.
And I think you're going to start to see them connect directly with the consumers, and I think that's when we're going to watch it pop.
That's exciting. I like it.
Yeah.
It's true. The From my first travel to Africa almost 20 years ago till today, I mean, Africa just leapt over the whole landline thing. I mean, the cell phone is so ubiquitous. I mean, service in parts of Eastern DRC are better than my house in Seattle. I mean, it's amazing reception. So, and this kind of link, closing that digital divide, is so exciting.
And there are
So
programs.
exciting.
There are programs that are doing just
Yep,
this.
yep.
There are organizations that specialize in getting the technology out, educating at that developing country level how to use it, and it's just kind of amazing to get out of the way and watch what they're doing. Very creative stuff.
Yeah. Well, as we've been talking, and I've been, thinking about the discussion and the answers, right? It seems like there's so many of the pieces in place, but maybe haven't quite been pulled together on the scale. I mean, you had mentioned, right, the level of certification, right, is still relatively small, and maybe it's a small company, if I may say, right, a relatively small company, selling. So it might be interesting to try to think and get your view on, what is it that could move the industry specifically, right, policies or practices or the things that others might do in order to help move in that direction. I mean, we've kind of told this, we might call it a value creation and capture story, where if you pay people more or have that cocoa farming have larger economic, social impacts, that then if you can have that value reflected in the marketplace, this might work out, right? But the two have to work together and be in sync. And at least right now, not a large portion of the industry operates that way. But the possibilities are there. I mean, some of your comments, Joe, are very inspiring, and you can imagine this is what it would be like. But just sitting here now, what are some practical things that we might think about doing that could help move the whole industry that way? And maybe not just, right, thinking about the businesses themselves, but maybe it's a public policy thing. Maybe it's something NGOs can do. Maybe it's something, are there some ideas you have about how we can push this along and kind of accelerate it if we've got a pretty good idea of what the model would look like and we know its pieces, but how can we accelerate it?
There's two things that I have an interest in, and there's so many different ways to do this, but they're just two things. Most development projects that I've seen it's like pushing on a string, and it doesn't really go anywhere. If you have a market, whether it's domestic at the origin country or international, and you pull on the string, investment floods in behind that. And so I think that there should be opportunities that are stronger for businesses and markets to engage with development efforts to help pull that string faster and stronger. And then the total radical thing, I would love to see USAID, all of the development organizations around the world take half of their budget and put it into consumer education in the countries where they operate. I think that the way that we operate as consumers of things and services, if we changed and had more awareness and more information available, I think that would help pull this through, because there are campaigns that are negative campaigns against companies, and I think that those are important for sparking awareness, but they're not inspiring. It's not let's inspire people. Let's get, instead of spanking somebody, let's actually give them a high five for doing the right thing. And I'd love to see that shift.
Yeah. If you come back to the first idea about linking in some of these efforts to development, do you have just an example or something you've seen in mind, being very practical about what that would look like, just help people imagine how that connection might be made stronger?
On the development side, the Congo is a great example. This is one where there was almost no cocoa sector to speak of. I think the first year I showed up there, they exported about 600 tons for the whole country. A lot of cocoa had been planted because coffee failed there, and this is a story that we're seeing in other parts of the world where coffee's failing because it's a higher altitude, things are getting warmer. Cocoa likes it low and wet. We committed that here's a specification, here's a market that will buy. We committed to 200 tons initially. It went so well, we brought it up to 340, and now we have a group of NGOs who have come in behind with donors who are really interested to support the communities, increasing their social fabric and well-being. And this is something that can scale. I mean, it really, truly is scalable. There's going to be 10,000 tons available from DRC next year, and I would love to see some of the other chocolate companies come in and sort of follow our model in those communities.
Right. So if I'm hearing you right, if I understand the model, it's a little bit of a demand side driven model where if you can go in and demonstrate, or a commitment to buying a certain kind of product, that there's plenty of resources out there on the development side that then could help nurture it and build it, but it might be useful to get someone to step in first and say,
That's
I'm
right.
interested and I would take it if you could make it to my specifications
Somebody
and needs.
has to take that risk,
Right.
and so when I first went over there going through militia-controlled regions, a lot of chocolate companies might not do that and work with these producers. But at the same time, there are other people who are part of these companies who know how to do that, who've spent time in places that like this and can be successful and can take some risks. And then building partnerships with local exporters and co-ops who really are at the front lines. Help bring them up. And so the price that we're paying is so much higher than what they were offered before with the training to support that price. Now there's real incentive. People say, if I work harder, tomorrow's going to be better than today is. And that's that basic ingredient of hope that we believe that's going to be better because of the hard work that I'm doing now, because there's that opportunity, is absolutely groundbreaking and life-changing. And that's what this industry can do.
I agree. It's exciting because what you have in Africa and probably any poor scenario is it's a very common principle that we all accept as a reality of life in the U.S., which is that proposition. If I work a little bit harder, I'm going to make a little more money. And that's something that is so ingrained in our DNA, we never question it. In Africa, they've never even heard of that proposition. And through the cocoa supply chain, through chocolate, it's an enormous opportunity to get more people exposed to the idea that you can earn more money if given the work. And that applies to people on the farm or technicians or anywhere throughout the value chain. But that gets back to the idea, too, of it's an economic problem that is behind a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Joe, you'd mentioned about maybe it is some smaller companies, some entrepreneurs, right? Who might be the first people in, right? Who's willing to take that risk, almost that development risk, as we would say. And then if you knew that there were others there in the NGOs or the governments who were willing to backfill then and start to build that infrastructure and the capacity to support, and then you would benefit. But then that would lower the risk for larger companies who may want to come in and then could see expanding and accelerating what's already put in place, where they may not come and do it right themselves, just maybe because they're so large in the way that they do the decision making, they may not want to go through those militia-controlled areas.
I just wanted to add that there's always the issue of supply versus demand. And in chocolate, in cocoa, we don't have the chicken and egg issue here. If demand builds, there will be a response in the supply. But it is far too difficult to ask the producers to invest in changes to get the supply up or to get their farm to certification. It's just very costly for an individual small farmer to do that.
Right.
But there is a huge response when they know the commitment to buy from them is there. They're much more willing to take that risk on and move the needle. And I think that there's a couple kinds of demand signals that are coming out. Consumers are sending them, through social media or through their purchasing power and their selection of products. And, companies do it by committing in 2020 to 100% certification or 100% sustainable cocoa supplies. But again, reiterate that we don't have the chicken and egg here. That if the demand steps up and gets to places like Eastern Congo, that the regulatory systems and the producer response can be pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. It's been a great discussion today. I really appreciate y'all coming. If there was some other issues in this area that we talked about that you think is just worth some further attention and maybe doesn't get the attention that it needs, I just want to go around and kind of ask, is there some areas or topics that you would say, in order to make progress in the areas that we've talked about, we really do need to spend more time understanding, right, some particular area or topic. Mike, do you have something that comes to mind?
Yeah, and I'm going to stay with what I just mentioned. I think we really are asking, a producer in Madagascar or the Congo a lot when we say make your production sustainable, and here's a list of standards we're going to measure you on, and then hope that in 3 years we'll be invited back to to do that. No, it takes a lot of hand-holding. It takes a lot of investment. It takes development assistance money. It takes private sector investment. And I think that that element has to be really well understood to get from the 10% to the 80 or 90% for the
Yeah.
world and its cocoa
Yeah.
is going to be it's going to be a long road, and it's going to be a lot of individual sacrifice and investment.
So just on that, can you think of the reasons why, if people are listening, saying, well, why would a large multinational want to commit to do that? What benefits do they get? I mean, we know all the other benefits, right, kind of society-wide, but why? What would be in it for a company to make that kind of an investment down the road? We might say, well, it's part of their social corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility. But for companies, that's a lot of money. Can you think of some reasons or some arguments that would be made that would persuade them that it actually is a smart business decision to do, as we had talked about, as well as creating a lot of good
Well,
in the communities?
I think that they've already understood that, and it's the future source of their company's well-being. They depend on cocoa beans for whatever product line they're putting out, and they have to have certainty in the quality and the quantity of those beans, and they will invest in this. Even for them, it's a large ask to take a cohort of producers up through all of this to get to what the world says, okay, now that's good, and have the blessing of certification or sustainability, codes of conduct, and these kinds of things that individual companies have. But they're doing it to protect their business, and they see that as a reasonably sound investment.
Yeah, so it would be fair to say that maybe where some of the certification might come and the push is not from the corporate social responsibility office, if you will, or sustainability office, but maybe in their procurement shop.
I
Right.
can validate that completely. Yes, we're seeing that. Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Joe, what do you think? What's something that we really need to continue paying attention to, and part of our discussion today?
I think that there would be a lot of value if the companies who are making claims about doing the right thing were working off of the same script. In other words, that we were reporting on the things that really matter, because today in the whole fair trade movement, I think fair trade is fractured. I think there are companies that are making claim that they're more than fair trade, or they have a different type of certification. The certification thing is complicated. When everybody's just trying to do the right thing, well, why don't we just actually report on what it is that we're doing and what the real impact is, and simplify this message so that consumers have an opportunity on a level scale, without there being any murky, cloudy message. This is who they are, this is what they do, and this is why I either support them or I don't. And it's also a way, I think, for us to imagine companies starting to compete legitimately on the social and environmental benefits that they provide. And not on some sort of aloof ideas of things being greener than that, but on real, actual impact. And that kind of competition, I think, is exciting. This idea that it's more expensive to be socially responsible or environmental, I think isn't it bizarre that that's even a question for us? I mean, as a culture, isn't that just bizarre? How could you say, well, I have a choice to do something that is more harmful short-term thinking, but it's cheaper than to do something that we would consider to be right? I think that's bizarre. And so the more we kind of take that out of our lexicon and our worldview and start to measure our real performance on an even scale with our arms locked together, then I think real change starts to happen.
Sure, that makes sense. But we'd have to admit, right, that making that transition could be pretty risky, right, for companies and or for individuals who are used to one level working in that kind of environment, responding to the market the way they do, and the suggestion of the way that you're doing it, well, it sounds very compelling, right? I mean, you could see that would put them at risk because they may not know what that other world is like.
Yeah, it's coming anyway. So
Yeah.
either they can get ready for it and embrace it and start to move in the right direction, but it's going to come anyway. And I think the companies or brands that are left behind are the ones that aren't willing to step up and be responsible and speak clearly and plainly with full transparency what it is that they do.
Yeah. So just to push that a little more, because it sounds like a really interesting and useful approach, but there's competition, right, amongst different certification firms, right? And I've heard people who worry about certification system moving in that kind of dilutes ones that might be considered right at a higher level, but companies are able to use it. I mean, how do we figure out amongst all these different certifications and the competition within them, if we're sympathetic to the firm for a moment who is thinking of doing the right thing, wants to do it, how do they, negotiate amongst all these different certification possibilities and get to where you're thinking they should be? What do they do?
There's, consumers, when you buy a $40 bag of groceries, it's going to take you 20 minutes and you'll make well over 300 decisions in that purchase. So oftentimes consumers just want to see that bug, that fair trade seal or rainforest or certified organic or something, so that they can check the box and move on to the next thing. I think that's a vast majority of consumers. There are a small subset who actually care and they peel back the onion. And if there was a way for the certification agencies, just like the brands and the manufacturers, to have a way of reporting to consumers publicly what the actual impact is, good or bad, then we're more honest and we're not hiding behind what many certifications are themselves, kind of their own brand. And I think that moving away from that is a positive thing. So I think it's simple. It's simple to say. I think it's the right vision. It's where we have to go, but it's going to take a lot of will from everybody within the industry to do it.
Yeah. And so maybe in this discussion, should we still think about certifying at the product level? Or again, what about the experience? I'd mentioned just Whole Foods, that for a lot of people, when you walk into that store, you're just kind of assuming and believing, right, that the people have put in there all the kinds of products that are the certain kind of product that you want to have. So you don't have to look at each label. And I wonder whether looking at kind of these iconic brands who then might embrace the idea, and then they're the ones who authenticate, right, whatever that product is, rather than having the individual consumer, although they're making a lot of choices. And I wonder what the future is of that, or do we see beyond Whole Foods many companies maybe moving in that direction, trying to present themselves as being in that way?
I think you do. My sense is Whole Foods pioneered that movement, and that's what they're known for. And I think in turn they've inspired a lot of other companies to look a little bit more closely at the products that they stock and be a little more diligent about knowing some of the backstories about some of the products on the shelves. So, and I think that all is, you look at that big, broad food movement, whereas Americans, we're willing to spend more money for higher quality products. We're willing to invest a little bit more time to know what's going on behind the story. And that movement encompasses the consumers, the producers, and the retailers. So I think, optimistically, that's definitely going to happen.
Yeah. Well, good. And then was there any, just because I'd gotten to the other ones, was there any particular issue from our discussion that you think, needs more attention, or should be looked at a little more carefully and understood as we're trying to put into place these different standards and have the cocoa grown a certain way?
Yeah, I think there's two things that come to mind, and we hit on both of them. But one is it's kind of it's a human story, chocolate, because it starts with some of the who are some of the most poorest humans on the planet, with some of the most wealthiest humans on the planet, who happen to be Americans eating chocolate every day at an alarming rate, and kind of closing the knowledge gap that exists between the people at the very beginning of the supply chain and the people at the very end of the supply chain. And it's almost as if you look at some of the issues in the industry, whether it's forced child labor or whether it's just low wages or environmental concerns that happen on cocoa farms, if people actually saw their fellow humans and saw what they live like and what an average day was like in the life of a cocoa farmer, they look at chocolate much more differently. So I'd love to see the industry continue to compress that supply chain to bring the people eating the chocolate as close as possible to the people producing the cocoa. The second thing that I'd come back to again is the idea of quality, and it should be you shouldn't be able to separate quality and sustainability. By that I mean, if people are going to spend an extra $1 on a chocolate bar or an extra 20% above the mass-produced confection, it ought to taste better, and if it does, they're going to understand and make that connection. The other important piece of quality is farmers who harvest a higher grade cocoa receive more income for that cocoa because it has a higher quality. That helps the economic problem that we've been talking about as well. So as the U.S. consumer becomes a little more aware of what is the difference between that $5 chocolate bar and that $2 chocolate bar, they're going to taste the difference and understand that the quality is there, and that with that quality means that the farmer's probably going to be better taken care of on the other end.
Yeah, that's a great summary, and that links very well to our kind of beginning discussion about how you agreed it was really kind of an economic-driven issue that might link cocoa farming, right, to some of the conflict and all that. So, in wrapping up, have we come up with a phrase that we're going to use instead of conflict-free chocolate? Anything come to mind?
Prosperity chocolate.
That's not bad.
I'll go with that one.
Prosperity chocolate.
chocolate.
Sure thing.
What if we tried responsible chocolate? Maybe. I mean that.
That works too. At least you're talking about, the presence of something positive.
Yeah, and it seems to kind of put the onus then on the company, whoever it is, to be selling a responsible product, right? Whatever that might be. So, well, we'll try that out. Maybe we'll come up with something better. Or maybe people who have been listening can send in a better answer than that one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it is open. It'd be great to hear what everyone else thinks.
yeah, that'll be good. Well, thanks to all of you. I really do appreciate the time, the discussion. I have a few more people to thank because it was quite an operation. This was a little bit of an experiment for our institute, the first time we've tried it, but it worked out so well, and thanks to the three of you for making that possible. I also want to thank the U.S. Institute of Peace, who helped fund this particular project, and there were a lot of people who came together and really helped make this production be successful. Larry Holland, the Holland Group, who was producer, and Christian Tillukson of Breakthrough Ideas, who was the producer, Omar at Vision View TV, who helped with the live feed, Mad Momos and Dharma Pharma Productions, the food. This is where we had our little lunch beforehand, so that was very nice of them. And many student volunteers, Sashwat Gadam, Omi Naidiri, Josh Doherty, Tristan Skoll, Rachel Plattner, and Julie Alderman. And I'd also like to add my own thanks to John Bertel, who works at the Institute of Corporate Responsibility. You gentlemen all know them from having worked, who really pulled this all together, and it wouldn't have been possible without him. To the audience, and for those of you who are there, thank you again for being a part of this. We will be posting this recorded show with the conversation, and you can continue to blog if you want to at conflictfreechocolate.com. That's all together, conflictfreechocolate.com. And we'll look to incorporate some of the other materials and things that we've had here on the ICR website. So thank you again for my guests for being here speaking, and thank you at the audience for being part of our event today.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Good. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
That's
great.
good.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
That's very good.
Yeah, awesome.
I guess we shouldn't walk too far until
Until you're